Hey there. I'm pretty excited about this one. This is a video that's going to go through a client onboarding experience using Jobber and quite a few other applications in order to create a really unique and seamless client experience, including Stripe, Google Sheets, a phone system, and I believe one more. Before we dive into the actual build inside of Zapier, though, I've taken the time to lay this out in a bit of a workflow so that you understand exactly the process visually before we go into the actual build. One of the things that's super important to remember throughout this video and in general with your integrations and automations is it's important to begin with the end in mind, but you don't necessarily have to complete it all at once. By nature, these things will grow as you add more systems, you want to add different steps, you want to automate more things that you do manually, but you don't have to get them all done at once. So while this video includes multiple Zaps and multiple different systems, you could start something like this to enhance your client onboarding experience with just one or two actions here. So let's take a look at what this looks like visually, and then I'll walk you through the build as well and show you the real example of how this works with your different systems. Let's go. All right, so here we have visually the layout for how this is going to be built in Zapier. As I mentioned, we have two different Zaps. This first Zap here at the top and a second Zap here off on the bottom. And the reason why we have two of these things is because this second Zap doesn't need to begin until an action is completed by the client here from the first step. So we can't run this all in a single Zap. For context here, what we're looking at is this particular user wanted to automate their client onboarding experience. And they described the process that they did that. So the client fills out a Jobber request form, and then they add their credit card information on file with Stripe. After that, then they wanted to update the lead status, send a confirmation email, add the client to their email list for future communication, add the client to a master tracking sheet, create a contact in their phone system, and then send a welcome text message. And so that's what we're going to walk through here today. So our first Zapier Zap starts with a request form being submitted in Jobber. Then we move to Zapier where we have a trigger that is listening for that Jobber request being created. And then we're going to create in Stripe what's called a checkout session, where it's going to create that checkout session link. And I just realized here, we actually need one more step because we need to send that checkout link to the user. So let's add that up here. And we're going to say send email with link. Okay, so that's going to go to the user. So our first step has four events that happened: the request form being submitted, the trigger in Zapier, and then two actions to create a checkout session and then email that link from the checkout session to the new lead, to the client, if you will. After that, once the user completes their checkout session, that's when all of this other magic happens. So the user completes the checkout session. Zapier here is listening for when that checkout session is completed. After that, we use Adhesion Connect to be able to update the client in Jobber. We then send an email to the customer, to the client. We then add the client to the email list. We add that client to our tracking sheet. We add the client to our phone system. And then finally, we send an SMS to the client, letting them know that their onboarding experience has been completed. So let's take a look at how we actually do that for these two particular Zaps in Zapier. Before we build here in Zapier though, we need to make sure we have a couple of things that are set up. One of the things that this particular user wanted to do was update the status of a client in Jobber. And so for that, we need to make sure we have a custom field on our client record here. So for this particular example, I've created this status field, and we can have these two potential options from this dropdown, which is new lead or paid client. They were wanting to update the status of the client to paid client after they completed that Stripe checkout process. So here we have our first Zap, and our Zap is triggered by a Jobber request created, and we're using the Adhesion Connect trigger here for Jobber request created. The second thing that we're going to do is we're going to create this checkout session using Stripe. And then the last step, which I originally had missed in my diagram, is that we are going to send an email with that particular checkout link. Okay, so let's see how this works in practice. I have the Jobber request form open here, already filled out with a little information. And I complete that Jobber request form. So that's done. So now we come back here to Jobber, and let's make sure we can see that request. We can see the request here. Now when we come to the trigger here in Zapier, we can see that request that was submitted. So we're going to continue with this record, and now we're configuring Stripe here. We're going to complete this checkout session. And in this instance, all we're doing is saving these payment details for later. Now what you want to do so that we have the Jobber ID for this particular client is we want to map the Jobber ID to this client reference ID field in Stripe here. And the way that we do that is we click this little plus button and we search for Jobber ID. And what we want is we want this client Jobber ID, because the record for this particular client in Jobber is based on the client ID. So we map the client ID here, and that's important for the second step in the second Zap. So complete all of your information here, customer email, we can map that, client email address, and map the rest of your information according to your particular Stripe checkout needs. Now we do need a success URL in here. And we should be good. Okay, so we're going to continue here, and we're going to test this step. Oops. Currency. Okay, so we can see what gets returned here is this checkout session information. And we should have a URL somewhere in here. Yep, here we go, down here at the very bottom. So this is the URL that's going to get sent to the customer to complete their checkout session. So the next step here is we map this to the email that we're going to send the customer, and we're going to send this to the client. So we need to map this information to the client's email address. We're going to say who it is from. Complete your onboarding. And then here we have the body. So thanks for, I don't know, signing up for service. Yada, yada, yada. And then, click the link below. And then we can add here it's going to be a URL. Here we go. So there's the URL from our second step to create that checkout session. Then we continue with this. And to review here, we've triggered this particular Zap based on the creation of a Jobber request. We've created a checkout session in Stripe where we mapped the client Jobber ID to the customer reference ID field in Stripe. Again, that's important for the second Zap that we're going to have. And then the last step is we're sending an email to that new client with that URL for them to complete the checkout. So if we go back to our diagram here, we've got the request form submitted, our trigger, our first action, and our second action. And so our first Zap is complete. Now our second Zap, it looks like a lot, but each one of these steps we're going to break down here on this second bit. So our second Zap here, number 2, is triggered by the checkout session being completed. So the checkout session that was just created in Zap number 1, that URL, that link was sent to the customer. When they complete that checkout session, your Zap here will be triggered. So what we're going to do is we're going to update this client. And I'm not actually completing this checkout session. So let's go back here and grab this Jobber ID. We need the Jobber ID for the client. Okay. All right, just for the sake of the video. Now we're going to update this client. Here, you would map this to the customer client reference ID. This would come directly from where you added it in the first step, or in the first Zap. So you would map this here. For the sake of this one, because I'm not actually completing a checkout, I'm just going to paste this information here so that you can see how that works. Now, we should see, let's refresh this here. Here we go. That custom field that we created here in Jobber for our status field now appears here in our update client action using Adhesion Connect. So our status, we can see we have 2 options, new lead, paid client. We're going to update this to paid client. Okay, so we have our Jobber ID here. Now, first name, last name, or company name is required. So what we're going to do is we're actually going to add a search step. And we're going to search based off of an email, since that we'll have that here from Stripe. And just to use this as an example, here's where you would map this in, customer email. But for this, we're going to use this example. Okay, so we've found the client. Now we're going to update the client. So we have the proper first name and last name. And so we're going to say first name and last name. Okay, so now we have the Jobber ID that came from the client reference field, the first name and last name that came from our find client step here. And we have our status updated to paid client. So let's continue this. I'm going to test that step, make sure it goes through. Once this is completed, we'll jump back over to Jobber to see if everything went through. So we're successfully tested here. Now we come back over to clients in Jobber. And we see our client here. And now we have status paid client. Okay, so this step is done and we can move on to the next step. We're going to send an email here and we're sending it to the client. So what we can do is we can just use the email address from our find client step here. And we can choose who it's from and we can add the body here, whatever you might want, your subject line, so forth and so on. Continue with those. The next thing we want to do is we're going to add and update a subscriber here in MailChimp. So our subscriber email is going to be our email address for our client from our Find Client step. Status subscribed. If you have any groups or anything like that, or any tags that you want to, you can do that. You can map in the name. So let's go grab the name. And if you have any additional information that you want to add here, here's where you would add it. So let's just test this here. Okay, that looks like it completed correctly. So we're going to come over here to our list in MailChimp, and we can see here that we now have that subscriber in MailChimp. The next thing we want to do is we want to add that client to a tracking sheet. And for the purpose of this, I created a very simple spreadsheet here: client name, jobber ID, email address. And so we have a step here to create a spreadsheet row. So we're going to configure this here. We have our spreadsheet selected, Zapier demo, our worksheet, and then you can see your columns here: client name, jobber ID, email address. Now all we have to do is map those fields directly from that second step. Find clients, the jobber ID gets mapped as well. Find clients, jobber ID, and then the email address. Continue, and test that step. Now let's go back to Google Sheets, and yeah, we should see here we have all that information now: client name, jobber ID, and email address. So we're almost done. The last two things we have to do is to create a contact in our phone system and send a text message. Your phone system will obviously be different. I have JustCall configured here. So here's where you would create a contact. Same thing, you map the information: last name, phone number, company, email address, any other information required for your particular phone system. And then the very last step is to send a text message. So you're going to send it to the phone number. And you're going to choose which particular phone number you're sending from if you have multiples, and what you want the text to say. Sign up complete. And that's it. So quick recap here. We have two Zaps. Our first Zap is triggered based on the request form being submitted using your jobber request form. The trigger in Zapier, where the jobber request has been created. Two actions: one to create a checkout session and one to send the email with that link for that checkout session. The second Zap follows the first Zap based on the completion of that checkout session. It then updates the client after it finds that client. It sends an email to the client with whatever information you would like. It adds the client to your email list, adds the client to your tracking sheet, adds the client to your phone system, and finally sends an SMS to the client. This is an incredible example of a very purpose-built client onboarding system. Hopefully this video gives you an example of how you might create your own client onboarding system. Again, just to reiterate from the beginning of the video, you don't have to boil the ocean. It doesn't have to be this complex from the very beginning. Think of this as a very, very polished example and how you might utilize some of these steps in your own client onboarding experience. I used Adhesion Connect as an example for some of the actions that are required, specifically around working with custom fields in this video. If you would like to trial Adhesion Connect as part of your jobber experience, there's a link in the description to get started for a free 21-day trial. Hopefully this video helps you on your journey to grow and scale your home service company. Thanks so much for watching. Have a great day.